This is Byleth using the new Divine Pulse mechanic to rewind time in Fire Emblem 3 Houses. I gotta tell you guys, this feature was something that I think the series really needed. It manages to solve and outright annihilate some fundamental problems found in previous Fire Emblem titles, and its addition as a whole makes 3 Houses a more well-designed game. Despite this, Nintendo and Intelligent Systems still managed to miss the mark on some key parts of the mechanic's design. So in this video, let's find out exactly what the Divine Pulse mechanic is, what it does well, and what could have been different to make it better as a potential future staple for the franchise. This is the untapped potential of Fire Emblem 3 Houses Divine Pulse. Forgive me everyone, but it's not even 2 minutes into the video and I've already lied to you when I said the Divine Pulse is a brand new mechanic. That's because Fire Emblem actually introduced a similar feature in its last 3DS outing. Mila's Turnwheel is an item that debuted in Fire Emblem Echoes: Shadows of Valentia, and it's functionally identical to 3 Houses' Divine Pulse counterpart. Both of these abilities allow players to rewind a battle to any moment in time, which means they can then continue from that point and change any unwanted moves or interactions they previously committed. I am not even going to pretend to understand how Mila's Turnwheel works in full, because Shadows of Valentia was definitely not the Fire Emblem game for me. I dropped it after like 2 hours and I just couldn't get into it, but I wanted to point out the mechanic's origin because it's clear that the developers want some kind of feature like this in modern Fire Emblem titles now that they've attempted it in consecutive games. In 3 Houses' implementation of this idea, players start out with a handful of uses early on in the game that increases significantly over the course of the adventure. The game does a nice job of introducing the Divine Pulse mechanic to players in a way that makes sense within the storyline, and it's a nice method of giving Byleth some desperately needed depth without making the mechanic feel forced. The ability to undo and redo turns during the player phase of combat is cool because it allows players to make a couple of mistakes during a chapter without being overly penalized for committing them. Most of the time, players are going to use a Divine Pulse to undo a move that resulted in a unit dying because that's the most costly outcome they could encounter on the battlefield. Well, unless that unit is Caspar, because in the grand scheme of deciding to save him at the cost of a single use of a constantly replenishable source of do-overs that resets after every battle, let's just say that I'll come visit his grave at the Garrick Mock Cemetery when the battle finishes. Thoughts and condolences go out to the von Bergliez family in the Adrestian territory for the loss of their son. But hey, even they have to know deep down that their boy is the worst unit in the game, right? Seriously, who would ever use this character willingly? Anyways, regardless of how a unit perishes, it's nice that the Divine Pulse mechanic allows players a chance to save them within a chapter instead of requiring the entire thing to be restarted to avoid unwanted deaths. It's almost like it's a nice hybrid approach between the game's casual and classic mode that can reduce potential time sinks found in pretty much every previous Fire Emblem game. This is especially true regarding a death happening at the very end of a chapter, and I appreciate a feature like this because older Fire Emblem games have put me in that nightmare scenario of having a unit get KO'd by some late chapter luck, which resulted in a complete chapter restart. You know, now that I mentioned some late chapter luck, there was this one time. You guys remember Lute from Sacred Stones, right? She's not my favorite mage ever, but she's always been a staple on my Sacred Stones teams whenever I do a playthrough of that game. I'm definitely someone who does not like to let units meet an untimely death during any Fire Emblem run, and if they do, you can bet that I'll be resetting a chapter to save them. I was on chapter 13 of Ephraim's route, and then it happened. A moment so unlucky that it's become lore amongst my friends and I. This bit of twisted fate unfortunately was not captured on video because it was on original hardware during a normal playthrough. But instead of just telling you the story of Lute's downfall, I want to present it in a way where everyone can really appreciate what happened. How about a play? I definitely think we can have some fun with that. Everyone, I'd like to introduce you to my girlfriend Slice, who will be playing the role of Lute. Hi guys! And my friend Mr. Steve, who will be doing the honor of bringing a random Chapter 13 Great Knight to life.
Hi, I'm Steven.
I'll be your narrator for this play, and with intros out of the way, let's set the scene to properly convey how this moment went down. This is the layout of Chapter 13 on Ephraim's Route. It's actually one of my favorite chapters in Sacred Stones, and it's characterized by narrow strips of land created by the vast amount of rivers that spiral towards the center of the map. The leader of the enemy team, Selena, is positioned dead center with bolting magic that can nearly cover the entire landscape. I spent more than an hour carefully maneuvering my units until I got to the point where a Great Knight was one of only a handful of enemies left guarding the bridge to Selena. Armed with the knowledge that Great Knights are weak to magic, I sent Lute in for the victory.
Excuse me, Mr. Great Knight, I'm Lute, and I'm going to need you to move away from this bridge.
I'm truly sorry, little girl, but I can't do that. I must guard Selena with my life.
We can fight if you want, but you know magic is good against Great Knights, right? I might sauce you up if we go through with this.
You know, I get that, but I'm not gonna lie. I'm feeling pretty confident with my trusty hand axe here. Couldn't tell you why, though.
It was at this moment that the two armies were at an unsolvable impasse. As the battle started, Lute was at a significant advantage. One magic attack would be enough to end the Great Knight and his positional grasp on the bridge, and she even had the fortune to attack twice in a single turn with an 89% hit chance on both strikes. However, the Great Knight did have one glimmer of hope should fate intervene, a 7% hit chance on a counterattack that would inflict near lethal damage on Lute. With this in mind, I was ready to taste a sweet victory. Lute apparently was not ready, because not only did she miss both hits with that 89% hit chance, the Great Knight decided to hit on his 7% chance and then follow up on the enemy phase of combat and again hit on those low odds.
The sauce wasn't enough.
Delicious.
Lute died in one of the unluckiest Fire Emblem plays I've ever seen, and all I could do is stare at the empty tile she once occupied, wondering what the heck just happened. When reality finally settled in, I knew it was time to restart the chapter and do everything over again to save her. But you know what could have remedied that entire situation? The Divine Pulse mechanic. Credit to Selena's army for breaking my will on that fateful day, but random bad luck can happen and it can be extremely frustrating to players when it occurs so late in a battle. The Divine Pulse mechanic eradicates the frustrating resetting part of that experience, but it still allows for crazy plays to happen, and in my opinion, that's for the betterment of the entire series. You know what else sucked in older Fire Emblem games? When reinforcements show up in unexpected places and ruin your entire strategy that you've invested time into crafting on the battlefield. Reinforcements are a staple of Fire Emblem games, and they are one of the aspects of the series I like for the added challenge, but I acknowledge that more casual players might not feel the same way about them. Reinforcements can sometimes be harsh difficulty spikes upon their arrival, but as you can probably guess, the Divine Pulse mechanic is a nice compromise in this situation. Later chapters in 3 Houses can have some brutal enemy reinforcements, especially if you're on maddening difficulty, but the game can do this because the developers have given players a tool to account for their arrival. Actually, some of the chapters in this game are specifically designed with this in mind. Bernadetta and Petra's paralog for the Black Eagles route immediately sticks out as one that took this into account. It's an interesting chapter that encourages players to capture several strongholds to seemingly gain an advantage, but then surprises players with an insane difficulty spike via reinforcements when that happens. The point where extra enemies arrive splits the chapter into 2 very distinct halves, and because Byleth will have access to several Divine Pulses at this point in the game, players can rewind once the reinforcements appear and adjust accordingly without compromising the first half of the battle. If this was in any other Fire Emblem game, the description I'm giving you now of this chapter would instead be an expletive-filled tirade because it would be terribly designed. But in 3 Houses, this kind of chapter can work because players have the ability to rewind time. Unfortunately, the ability to use a Divine Pulse doesn't exist in real life, and that's a bummer because there are definitely a few things that the developers did not execute on properly or simply missed. The most prominent issue with this new mechanic is that Nintendo and Intelligent Systems were too eager to make it a part of the player's arsenal and way overextended the amount of times Byleth can activate it. 3 Houses initially gives the player only a handful of charges, but by the end of my first run, I had 13 Divine Pulses at the start of each late game chapter. This high number of uses is actually a significant flaw in the mechanic's design because it allows players the opportunity to make too many mistakes. And while that might not sound like it's a bad thing, let me explain. 3 Houses at the end of the day is a strategy game that should require some mastery of basic tactics to be beaten. As the player progresses, they should be treated to harder experiences where mistakes are more costly as the game ramps up the difficulty. Because Divine Pulses can be used so frequently at the end of the adventure, the overall level of strategy is watered down significantly because players can be carefree with their units without any real penalty. Players don't have to use any sort of masterful movement or positioning and can rely more on trial and error. And hey, I did it a couple of times in the late game too. I don't remember the exact chapter, but I sent Claude into a horde of powerful enemies just to see if he could beat them all because there was no consequence if he didn't. And look, there was never any real danger because we all know that Claude is the best unit in the game. Fight me on that in the comments, but even if something had happened, using 1 Divine Pulse is an extremely minimal price to pay. This screams imbalance, and I think it would have been better if the game limited players to only a handful of charges. Somewhere in the 3 to 5 range sounds right to me, but I think even if Nintendo went with 5 to 7, the mechanic would have been better overall. Another questionable aspect of Divine Pulses is the way that 3 Houses handles the same interaction before and after one is used. Any outcome that occurs before a Divine Pulse is used will always remain the same after one is used if the player does the exact same interaction. That sounds a bit confusing on the surface, so let's illustrate what I mean with an example. This is my homegirl Petra attacking an enemy and landing a critical hit, even though she only had a certain % chance of doing so. If I use a Divine Pulse and attack the same enemy with the same method, she crits again. But it's not because I got lucky and rolled another crit. It's actually because the game keeps the result of the first interaction after Divine Pulse has been used instead of redoing any battle calculations. This means that the outcome of all successful attacks, misses, criticals, ability activations, and level ups will always play out the same way before and after the use of a Divine Pulse. And hey, I get why Nintendo went this route because the mechanic's introduction in the story is to allow Byleth to know the future and avoid negative outcomes. But I can't express how strongly I feel this was the wrong decision. Knowing the outcome of an interaction means that the Divine Pulse is an exceptionally rewarding move with literally 0 risk involved, which kinda goes against the whole design of Fire Emblem when you think about it. Take this scenario for example. A player just defeated a wave of enemies placed near the boss and can only use a unit or 2 in the current turn to attack him. One of the units attacks with a decently high chance to kill the boss but misses and instead dies, causing the player to rewind time. If the game were to re-roll the battle calculations, players could take a chance attacking the boss again and they might secure the victory. But no, 3 Houses won't let us have that chance because that unit will always miss and die every single time unless something changes with the condition of the fight. I don't like this because it means that the Divine Pulse mechanic isn't reaching its full potential as a strategic maneuver, and it's instead being relegated to being a magic eraser that undoes negative outcomes. The static output bothers me even more when it comes to level ups remaining the same after a Divine Pulse has been used. Don't get me wrong. There's an easy argument to make that allowing players to retry chances at level ups allows them to make super units, but I think that falls apart quickly for one reason. If players are using Divine Pulses to try and get optimal level ups, that means they are not using them to fix any previously made mistakes. That scenario can only happen if their tactics were good enough to afford them spare Divine Pulses. So in this context, allowing them to have more chances at better level ups means they are actively being rewarded. This would have completely balanced the risk-reward issue mentioned earlier, and I think it's a real missed opportunity of the mechanic. Even though level ups can't be changed, I still got the most mileage out of my Divine Pulses by manipulating them. If a character got a level up I wasn't satisfied with, I would just use a charge to undo it and then shelve that character until the next chapter where I'd get more chances. Or that's probably just me being a maniac playing Fire Emblem. Who knows? Overall, the Divine Pulse mechanic is a much needed feature in Fire Emblem 3 Houses. It gets rid of several nightmare scenarios that players could fall into in past titles, while also giving Byleth her signature gameplay hook as the protagonist. It's a bit imbalanced, which makes the endgame a little less tactical, and the lack of a reroll is something that I personally thought could have been done differently. But I think a modified take on the Divine Pulse concept is something that should become a staple of the Fire Emblem franchise. But hey, that's just my take on it, so give me yours by dropping a comment below. Thank you so much for watching one of my videos. It means a lot to me that you're here, and if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like on it and subscribe to the channel so we can help it grow. I love making content on game design and Nintendo topics, but I do some other stuff too, like tier lists and personal stories. I'm on some social media platforms if you'd like to get to know me better, and the links for them will be in the video description. My name is Super, and like me, I hope you'll have the chance to be super today too.